All right, let's see if we can't keep this under 5 minutes this time. So what we're going over right now is how to control the exposure triangle in manual mode on the Nikon D5600. Why the Nikon D5600? Very accessible, it's inexpensive, it's really small, it's really light, and it's pretty much available at any box store. So it works pretty well as a blogger camera, mostly because it's got the flip screen. And yes, you can go with Canon, but we have a Nikon here. All right, so how do we control the exposure triangle on this camera? Well, we're going to see right here, we have the visual representation right here, which will show you the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. Shutter speed is going to be the duration that the shutter is open. So the lower the number, the longer the shutter is open. So we go all the way down to 1 second. It will be open for 1 second. If you wanted to shoot at night on a tripod, then you can get pictures of the stars as low as 10 seconds. 15 seconds would be better. 20 seconds, you might start to see the actual movement of the stars, star trails at the beginning. But that's only for your long exposure, and if you're shooting during the daytime, the only way you're going to be able to get long exposures is with neutral density filters, which is essentially sunglasses for your camera lens. So let's put this back to 1/50th of a second. So at 1/50th of a second, this is what we'd be shooting at in live view mode. So because we're shooting at 24 frames per second, due to the 180-degree shutter rule, you don't need to know what that means. Just know that if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you would want to shoot at 1/148th of a second. Since we don't have 1/148th on here, 1/50th is close enough. If you were to say shoot at 30 frames per second, then that should be 1/60th. If you want to shoot at 60 frames per second, then you would be shooting at 1/120th of a second, which we don't have also on this camera. So we would be shooting at 1/125th. All right, now speaking of general purpose, general application shutter speeds, 1/125th is okay for handheld. If you have steady hands, you can get by with, I would say, as low as 1/60th. If you have a vibration reduction, which we do have in this kit lens here, that can give you like 2 to 3 stops of image stabilization, which will allow you to shoot at slower shutter speeds, at still objects, and still keep it in focus. And I guess on the higher end of the shutter, if you're shooting with flash, then Nikons like this will sync at 1/200th of a second. And that will include the pop flash that's in the camera. So 1/200th of a second would be your flash speed. If you're shooting moving objects, then 1/200th is okay, but I would recommend going up to 1/250th. And that will freeze most action, barring anything that's moving particularly fast. All right, moving on to the aperture control. There is no direct dial. So as you can see on the D5600, this one control dial here controls the shutter speed. And there is no dedicated dial for aperture control, and there's no dedicated dial for the ISO control, which is the third part of the exposure triangle. So for controlling our aperture, we can see right here that little symbol right there, that is supposed to be an aperture. So that's showing you that in addition to controlling what is called the exposure value compensation, it can also control the aperture. So we push that button down, and that will allow us to close the aperture. So this is wide open with this lens at f3.5. And you can see that as the number increases, the size of the aperture, as indicated by this graphical representation, decreases. So by closing down on the aperture, you are increasing the depth of field, which is the amount of image that's in focus. When you open up the aperture, it's going to decrease the depth of field, which means that less of your image will be in focus. Why would you want to do that? if you're shooting pictures of objects or persons in front of a background and you want to soften the focus of the background or blur it out, as a lot of people like to say, then you would shoot with a wider aperture. So unfortunately, that blurring effect is not going to be particularly great with an f3.5 lens unless the background is significantly far away from the subject. All right, so the last part of our exposure triangle is the ISO. And the way that you can control that on this camera is you can assign the function button when held down to increase or decrease the ISO. So the ISO, it stands for International Organization of Standardization, and it kind of harkens back to the old days of photography when everything was done on film, and that referred to the size of the grains in the film emulsion. So the smaller the grains, the lower the ISO, and the larger the grains, which meant they exposed faster, more sensitivity, the higher the number. But all you really need to know is that this will increase the signal gain, which will increase the, I don't want to say the sensitivity of the sensor, but it will allow you to shoot in lower light. So in this instance, if we wanted to shoot at 1/250th of a second at f3.5, we would have to bump up the ISO to 5000. Now, why wouldn't you always shoot with the higher ISO? Well, the problem is that increasing the ISO introduces digital artifacts like this noise, and it can also effectively reduce the sharpness and image clarity in general. Whenever possible, shoot with a lower ISO, and mostly you're going to be doing that by increasing the amount of light. Now, if you're shooting with natural light, then obviously you can't do that, which means in order to shoot with a lower ISO, you're going to have to do something like either decrease the shutter speed or open up the aperture. Since the aperture is already wide open, we can't do that. And that's pretty much your exposure triangle right there. And as far as, we already talked a little bit about the applications for why you would change the shutter speed. We talked about the applications for why you would open up or close the aperture of the lens. And we also talked a little bit about why you would want to shoot in general with lower ISO. For the most part, the only reason why you would want to go with a higher ISO is because that's the only way you can get the proper exposure with the shutter speed and the aperture setting of the lens. And that's pretty much your exposure triangle, and that's done as quickly as I can do it. I was shooting for 5 minutes, but we went a little bit over. So hopefully that's helpful. Any questions, go ahead and pop them in the comments, and I'll get back to you on those.